March 2019, Harlows Creek, Virginia. The county administration building parking lot held 43 people on a morning cold enough that breath came visible, and a clerk with a plastic clipboard and a handheld microphone stood on a portable step stool and read property descriptions in a voice calibrated for efficiency rather than atmosphere. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to Clara Marsh stood at the back of the group, behind the developers and the investors and the man from the county assessor's office who was there to observe rather than bid. She was wearing Daniel's canvas coat. Her own coat was still in the hall closet where she'd put it in November, after the funeral, and hadn't touched since. Daniel's coat was a size too large. The sleeves came down over her wrists. She had $200 in her coat pocket. Not 200 and something. Not 200 plus whatever was left in her checking account. $200 was her checking account balance, transferred to cash that morning at the drive-through ATM on Main Street, because she needed to know the number was real and cash made it real in a way that a card balance on a screen didn't. The clerk reached Lot 27 on the clipboard. Alderman Mill property, 14.3 acres, Blue Ridge Road. Structure condition rated poor, environmental assessment pending, minimum bid $200. Nobody moved. Clara raised her hand. That's the arithmetic of the story. A woman in a too large coat raising her hand in a parking lot while 42 other people stand still. But arithmetic tells you what happened and not why, and the why starts 11 months earlier in a garden on a Wednesday morning in April when Clara found her husband Daniel lying face down between the tomato stakes with his hand still curved around the trowel he'd been using to make planting holes in the earth. Daniel Marsh had been 59 years old. His last checkup in February had come back unremarkable, which was the word his doctor used, and Daniel had reported home with satisfaction. He'd eaten sensibly, walked 3 miles every morning before the day started, drank no more than 2 glasses of wine on weekend evenings, and had been planting tomatoes that Wednesday because he'd read that mid-April was the optimal starting window for their growing zone. Daniel was a man who read about things before doing them. Clara had found that trait steadying for 31 years of marriage. He was dead before she finished calling 911. He'd grown up in Shenandoah County, graduated from the same high school their son would graduate from, come back after college because he'd told Clara he'd looked around at other places and found them wanting. That was how Daniel made decisions. He researched them first, concluded they were right, and committed to them without visible second-guessing. He'd never seemed to doubt Clara the way some men doubted the people closest to them, looking for cracks to worry about. He'd assumed she was capable, told her so early in their marriage, and then let her be capable without monitoring it. She'd appreciated that from the beginning and had never found reason to appreciate it less. The first 2 months after that are not easy to describe because they don't have clear edges. She moved through them the way a person moves through a house in the dark, knowing roughly where the furniture is, occasionally walking into something anyway. She answered calls she can't remember making. She signed documents her attorney explained multiple times because the first time and the second time the words came apart before they reached the part of her brain that retained things. She ate the casseroles neighbors brought over, and then didn't eat them, and then couldn't remember which. Daniel had managed their finances. That was their arrangement, suited to who he was. He found genuine pleasure in balanced columns and accurate projections, in knowing exactly where things stood, in the quiet satisfaction of a number that came out right. He managed their mortgage, their savings, their retirement accounts, the property insurance, the utilities, all of it with the competence of a man who read about things before doing them. Clara had known the broad shape of their financial life without knowing the specifics. That had been fine for 31 years. It stopped being fine in month 3, when the fog thinned enough for her to sit at Daniel's desk and open the files he'd kept in green hanging folders in the bottom drawer. The mortgage had 11 years left. Manageable in the abstract. In the specific, it required monthly payments larger than she'd registered, because Daniel had always handled them, and she'd always known the rough amount without tracking it precisely. The retirement account was the harder number. Daniel's mother had spent 4 years in a memory care facility before her death in 2017, and the cost of that care, which Medicare hadn't covered and Daniel hadn't mentioned he was drawing from savings to fund, had reduced the retirement balance to something that looked different when she held it against 11 years of mortgage payments and her own age of 56. Not emptied. Reduced to a number that made the mouth go dry when you sat quietly with it. She could do bookkeeping. She'd done it for years, part-time, for local businesses that needed someone who understood numbers without being able to justify a full-time accountant. She'd stopped in 2016 when Daniel got sick, the bacterial infection that resolved in 3 weeks, but had felt serious enough at the time that she'd let her client list drift away, and she'd never rebuilt it. She could rebuild it. Good bookkeepers were findable in Harlow's Creek. But clients took time to find. Bills arrived on schedule regardless. Month 5, she'd scraped together enough bookkeeping work to keep the electric on. Month 6, the electric was on, and the mortgage was 1 month behind. Month 7, she caught up on the mortgage using what remained in savings, and the savings account read 0. By month 8, she had $200 in checking and was turning over the idea of calling Owen. Her son was 28, worked in finance in Charlotte, had been home twice since April, both times for a week. He'd left both times with the contained anxiety of someone who has assessed a situation, found it serious, and understands that the person inside it doesn't want to be told it's serious yet. He would help without needing to be asked twice. The asking was the part Clara wasn't ready for. Instead, she went to the hall closet. She told herself she was looking for her winter coat. Maybe she was. What she found near the back of the top shelf was Daniel's interesting box. He'd called it that himself, without self-consciousness, a clear-sided plastic storage bin with a blue lid that he'd maintained for as long as she could remember. It held newspaper clippings and printed articles and handwritten notes on subjects that had caught his attention at various points over 4 decades. Heirloom tomato cultivation. The architectural history of colonial-era grist mills. Monarch butterfly migration routes. The geology of the Blue Ridge. Articles about the Revolutionary War alongside hand-drawn maps of local hiking trails he'd always intended to take on weekends and never did. The bin was a record of everything Daniel had found worth knowing about, even when nothing came of the knowing. Near the bottom, printed on a single sheet from what appeared to be the Shenandoah County Land Records website, dated 3 years earlier, was a page about the Alderman Mill property. Clara read it sitting on the closet floor with the bin in her lap. The Alderman Mill had been built in 1743 by a man named Ezekiel Alderman, a Philadelphia merchant who'd relocated to the Shenandoah Valley following a period of land speculation and built a working grist mill on a creek tributary that provided reliable water through most of the year. The mill had operated without significant interruption for nearly 200 years, grinding corn and wheat for surrounding farms, passing through the Sutter family's hands in 1892, before the last working miller, Roy Sutter, died in 1951. Roy's widow Edna maintained the property until her own death in 1962. After that, the mill had sat empty through 2 estate sales that ended inconclusively, eventually passing to county ownership when property taxes went unpaid long enough that the county had no practical choice. The county had attempted to sell the property at auction every year since 2003. Environmental assessments had flagged the surrounding acreage for soil testing due to historic agricultural chemical use, and those flags had deterred every developer who looked at the property from seeking financing, because no bank would lend against a site with unresolved contamination questions. The minimum bid was $200. Nobody had ever bid. Daniel had printed this page 3 years ago and placed it in the interesting box between an article about millstone construction methods and a printout about the Shenandoah Valley's role in provisioning both sides during the Revolutionary War. She read it 3 times. Not quickly. She sat on the closet floor and read it the way she'd watched Daniel read things that genuinely interested him, going back over sentences, pausing, reading forward again. By the 3rd reading, she had the specifics fixed in her mind clearly enough that she could have recited them back in order. The year the mill was built, the name of the last miller, the environmental assessment, the 16 years the county had been trying to divest the property, the minimum bid, $200. She put the sheet back in the box, put the box in the closet, went downstairs, and made dinner. She didn't think about the mill again for 2 weeks. Then she did think about it, briefly, while lying in bed trying to locate sleep, and again on a Thursday afternoon while doing bookkeeping at a veterinary clinic when the numbers on the page in front of her temporarily stopped resolving into meaning. $200. Minimum bid. Everything in her account against everything nobody else had wanted for 16 years. The intersection of those two facts had a quality she couldn't quite name. Not coincidence, which implied randomness. Not sign, which implied certainty she didn't have. Something between those two things. A piece of information that might be relevant and might not. She looked up the next county auction date. March 14th, 2019. She didn't tell Owen. Didn't mention it to Dorothy Whitfield next door, who had opinions about most things and expressed them with the directness of a woman who'd concluded that softening things made them persist longer than necessary. She drove to the county administration building on a Thursday morning in March with $200 in the pocket of Daniel's coat and stood at the back of the crowd. Harlow's Creek was a town of 4,000 people in the lower Shenandoah Valley, the kind of place where the Chamber of Commerce ran an autumn festival and the local paper covered high school sports with more column inches than state politics, and most of the commercial real estate had changed hands at least twice in 20 years as development moved through in waves that left some blocks flourishing and others waiting for the next one. People knew each other well enough to nod on the street and remember last names and know whose father had been whose neighbor. That familiarity made certain things efficient and made other things difficult. It made it hard to do anything without someone knowing about it before noon. The people in front of Clara at the auction were a type she recognized from years of occasionally attending chamber events with Daniel. Developers were the clothing of men who owned things and intended to own more. Vest pockets with pens, leather portfolios, shoes recently cleaned. Two investors from Washington stood near the middle of the group, talking quietly in the way of people performing unconcern. They'd driven down that morning to look at 3 lots they'd shortlisted. The Alderman Mill was not among them. Raymond Voss stood near the front, separate from the Washington investors by about 6 feet, which was how Raymond preferred it. He developed roughly a third of the commercial real estate within 15 miles of Harlow's Creek over 20 years and had reached the position in a county's commercial life where he could stand slightly apart from a crowd because everyone was aware of him and he was rarely required to prove it. Clara had spoken to him twice. Once at a chamber dinner Daniel had taken her to in 2012, and once when Raymond had approached Daniel about selling the back acre of their property for a drainage easement. An approach Daniel had declined politely and Raymond had accepted with the grace of a man already thinking about the next option before the conversation ended. Raymond had looked at the Alderman property. Everyone in Shenandoah County who'd ever thought about real estate had looked at the Alderman property. 14 acres on Blue Ridge Road. A historic stone structure, a creek with functional water rights. On paper the bones were there. In reality the environmental assessment had scared away every bank Raymond had approached about financing. And without financing the math on any development plan didn't work and Raymond didn't spend money he couldn't finance. He stood near the front with his clipboard and didn't move when the clerk called Lot 27. Clara raised her hand from the back. The clerk looked up, found her face in the group. $200. From the lady in the back. Do I have any other bids? Silence. Raymond turned and looked at her, then looked back at the clerk. One of the Washington investors leaned toward the other and said something. The second one shook his head. Going twice. Raymond's jaw moved side to side. He looked at Lot 27 on his clipboard, looked at Clara, ran a calculation that took less than 3 seconds and came out negative. He put his pen in his vest pocket. Sold. To the lady in the back. $200. The remaining lots on the clipboard took 45 minutes to work through. Clara stood at the back of the crowd for all of them, hands in Daniel's coat pockets, watching the bids come in and the hands go up. Raymond acquired 1 commercial lot and declined a second. The Washington investors conferred and eventually raised paddles on a parcel of frontage near the county line. Normal commerce. Normal men spending money in the ways they'd come there to spend it. When it was over, she stood for a moment on the asphalt while the crowd dispersed around her. A woman she didn't know, older, carrying a leather portfolio, stopped near her and looked at the receipt in Clara's hand. Alderman Mill, the woman said. That's been on the county books for years. 16 years, Clara said. The woman nodded, studied her briefly, moved on. Nobody else said anything. Nobody came over to offer congratulations or ask why. She wasn't sure which response would have been appropriate because she wasn't entirely sure which category this fell into herself. She sat in her car for a few minutes before driving. Looked at the receipt. The county seal in the corner, the lot number, her name in the clerk's handwriting, the amount paid. She folded it carefully in half, and put it in Daniel's coat pocket and drove home. Raymond was waiting by the door of his truck in the lot, and he walked over when he saw her coming. He said her name the way people say names when they want you to understand they know who you are. He said he was sorry about Daniel, which was genuine in the neutral way of someone who had known Daniel in passing and acknowledged his death appropriately. "That mill," he said. "You know what you're buying. I read the assessment. Environmental's still open. 6 years open. No bank in the state will lend against a property with an unresolved contamination flag. You can't finance it, you can't develop it, you can't improve it enough to resell it for more than the land value." He paused. "White elephant. Maybe." Raymond studied her with the quick assessment of a man who has reached conclusions before other people finish speaking. "I'll give you 500 for it right now. You walk away 300 clear, I take it off your hands." Clara put the receipt in Daniel's coat pocket. "No, thank you." Something moved through his expression. "Recalculation. Offer's good for 30 days. After that, the environmental situation complicates my number, and it goes down." He walked toward the Washington investors. Clara drove home, sat in the kitchen. The bird feeder outside the window above the sink was occupied by a pair of house finches conducting a loud argument about access to the single perch, with the focused intensity of creatures for whom this was the most consequential thing happening in the world, which for them it was. She called Owen. He answered on the second ring, which was what he always did when she called, a response time that required keeping the phone within reach regardless of what else he was doing, and she knew it. "I bought something today," she said. "What did you buy?" "A mill. Alderman Mill, on Blue Ridge Road, 9 miles from here. It's been abandoned since 1962. The structure's in poor condition. There's a pending environmental assessment, and it's 14 acres. The silence on Owen's end lasted long enough that she could hear him breathing, which meant he was processing rather than about to speak. "Mom, the minimum bid was $200. That's what I paid." "That's your entire checking account?" "Yes. The environmental assessment on that property has been open for 6 years. I've seen it come up at county planning meetings. Nobody can get financing against it without the assessment cleared." A pause. "What are you going to do with it?" She looked at the finches. One had given up and flown off. The other sat on the perch eating sunflower seeds with total conviction. "I don't know yet." Daniel had a page about it in his interesting box. He'd printed it 3 years ago and kept it. Owen was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't mean he'd have bought it," he said carefully. "No, but it means something about it held his attention long enough that he kept it. And I find that worth going to look at." She paused. "I'm going to go look at it." He made her promise to call if she needed anything. She promised. They said they loved each other. She refilled the bird feeder and then sat at Daniel's desk that evening with the auction paperwork in front of her and whatever she could find about Ezekiel Alderman online. There wasn't much. A genealogy site placed him in a family tree. Born Philadelphia, 1712, died Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, 1791. A footnote in a digitized 1887 county history described him as a prosperous merchant, supporter of the patriot cause, known for substantial charitable contributions to the region's early institutions. The footnote mentioned, without expanding, that Alderman had remained at his mill property during the British advance through the valley in 1778 rather than evacuating with most of his neighbors, which some contemporaries regarded as eccentricity and others as courage. Clara wrote on a notepad, 1778. Then, beneath it, stayed at the property during British advance. Then, beneath that, prosperous merchant. She looked at those 3 lines for a while. Then she went to bed. Dorothy Whitfield came over the next morning at 9. She knocked twice, let herself in when Clara called, sat at the kitchen table, accepted coffee, and said, "Alderman Mill," with the tone of a person who had known for 12 hours and was deciding what to do with the information. "Raymond Voss couldn't give that property away," Dorothy said. "Raymond Voss can't get financing against it. That's a different thing. You paid $200. I know what I paid." Dorothy was not unkind. She was 71 and had been telling people hard truths for most of those years because she'd concluded that softening them allowed problems to run longer than necessary. "Clara, you're 8 months out from losing Daniel. You have less money than you should. And you've spent everything in your account on a property that 16 years of developers couldn't make work. It's a historic site. Ezekiel Alderman built it in 1743. He was a merchant, and he stayed at the mill during the British advance in 1778 when most people fled. Dorothy looked at her coffee, and Daniel kept a printout about it for 3 years. The kitchen was quiet. A car passed outside. Why would he stay? Dorothy said. That's what I keep coming back to. The neighbors fled. The practical thing was to go. The only reason a man stays when the British are coming is if whatever he's protecting is safer kept in place than moved. Dorothy looked at her coffee mug for a moment. That's a theory. It's the only theory that makes the behavior make sense. Merchants left their properties during military occupations because property could be rebuilt and portable goods couldn't be recovered once requisitioned. The only reason to stay was if what you were protecting couldn't be taken easily, because it was too large to move, or because it was already hidden. Dorothy was quiet again. Or he was stubborn. He might have been both. Dorothy set her mug down. You know what I looked up last night, she said. After someone called me about the auction. Clara waited. British forces moving through the Shenandoah Valley in 1778. They were after provisions, primarily. Grain, livestock, anything that could feed a military force on the move. Mill owners were a specific target because a working mill meant grain storage nearby. She paused. If you were a merchant with significant assets in coin and goods, and British forces were moving toward your property, and you'd prepared for that possibility in advance, staying at the mill would be the rational choice. Leaving would mean leaving whatever you'd hidden with nobody to guard the entrance to it. Clara looked at her. I'm 69 years past gullible, Dorothy said. But that's a theory with internal logic. Dorothy set her mug down. She looked at Clara with the expression of a woman revising a position. When do you want to go? Tomorrow morning. 7 o'clock. I'll come with you. Clara started to say she didn't have to. Dorothy waved it off before she could finish. Work boots. Good flashlight. That creek valley holds cold in the morning. She was at Clara's door at 6:53, wearing a barn coat and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and doesn't require further discussion. Blue Ridge Road wound through open farmland and then into lower forested hills, following a creek valley south toward the county line. The Alderman property came off the road by a gravel track that had grown grass up its center spine, 2 tire ruts with a green median, in the years since regular vehicles had stopped using it. Clara drove slowly, feeling the ruts through the car's chassis. The land on both sides of the track was overgrown in the way of land left alone for decades rather than abandoned. The difference mattered. Abandoned land went to scrub and invasive species, the aggressive plants that moved into disturbed ground. This land had the look of a meadow in progression, native grasses and young hardwoods establishing themselves in the order nature preferred, the particular density of a field edge that had been finding its own equilibrium for 60 years without interference. In spring it would be dense with birdsong. In summer the grasses would reach shoulder height. You could feel the patience of it, a piece of ground in no hurry about anything. The first thing visible through the trees was the wheel. 20 feet in diameter, iron framework and rotted wood, standing against the mill's north wall in the flat gray of old metal that has spent decades in weather. Sections of the wooden paddles had given way at various points across 60 years of exposure, leaving gaps in the wheel's circumference. But the iron held the shape, and against the stone of the mill's side wall and the pale March sky, the wheel had a quality you felt before you named it. A thing built with a specific purpose, still arranged for that purpose, held in place by its own iron memory of what it was for. The mill itself occupied a slight rise above the creek. The foundation graded into the slope, so the building sat level. Stone construction, 2 stories. The granite a blue-gray color that came from somewhere close because stone of that weight was not transported far in 1743. The mortar between the stones had crumbled in many joints and failed entirely in others, and the upper east corner showed several stones that had shifted inward over decades of freeze-thaw expansion. The roof was corrugated tin laid over what had been wood shingles, and the tin had peeled away in sections over the years, its edges curled upward by repeated wind, leaving gaps through which 60 years of rain and snow and birds had entered the upper floor. The mill race ran along the north face of the building. A stone channel, dry-laid granite walls, designed to carry water from the creek upstream to the wheel. A section of roughly 15 feet near the channel's midpoint had collapsed outward, the stone walls gone, the stones scattered down the bank. The creek itself ran fast with snow melt, cold and clear over a bed of rounded river stones that had been rounded there longer than the mill had stood. In the narrow gorge where the creek ran between two low rock shelves, the water made a specific sound, not the flat rush of open water, but something more resonant, contained, amplified by the stone on both sides. It was the sound the wheel would have heard for 2 centuries. The sound Ezekiel Alderman would have heard from inside the mill on every working morning of his life here. Dorothy got out of the car and stood looking. "Well," she said, "nothing else." Against the south face of the building, a row of stone foundation blocks had been added at some point after the original construction, the mortar color and setting style distinguishing them clearly from Alderman's original work. Someone had cared about this building well into the 20th century. Roy Sutter grinding grain until 1951, maintaining the structure, patching what needed patching. The care was visible in the building's bones even now, 60 years after the last person had walked through the main door with any intention of walking back in. Clara laced her work boots, pulled on the gloves, put the flashlight in her coat pocket. She walked across wet March grass to the mill's main door, which was iron-banded oak on iron strap hinges, still hanging in its frame though one hinge had pulled partly from the stone, leaving the door angled, its lower corner resting on the stone sill. She looked at the door before touching it. The iron bands were the kind of ironwork she'd seen in photographs of colonial-era buildings, handmade, individually fitted, each strap slightly different from the next because made by a single pair of hands rather than a mold. Someone had spent real time on this door. The iron had a texture under her gloved hand that was different from modern metalwork, irregular and dense, the product of methods that no longer existed. She pulled it open, lifting slightly at the bottom to clear the sill. The air inside was stone and earth and old wood, and underneath both something colder and more still, the enclosed air of a space that has been holding the same molecules for a very long time. Light came through the 2 east-facing windows, both missing their glass, the frames intact but bare. In the center of the ground floor, occupying most of the room, the millstone assembly sat in its original position. 2 circular stones, horizontal, the lower one fixed into the foundation, the upper one designed to rotate against it on a wooden spindle that had long since rotted out. The upper stone had cracked through its center, a fracture running from edge to edge with a geometry that looked almost deliberate. Dust coated both stones in a layer thick enough to have lost the texture of the stone beneath. Cobwebs in the ceiling corners had become structural, holding their own shapes independently of anything they touched. A staircase climbed the east wall, 3 of its treads missing, the rest appearing solid. Clara tested each board with her weight before committing to it. The second floor was narrower than the ground level, the roof line cutting into the space on the west side where the tin had failed and the boards beneath had eventually surrendered to accumulated snow weight, leaving an opening through which pale March light fell onto a pile of rotted lumber below. The grain hopper, the wooden funnel that had fed grain down to the millstones, still hung in its original position, the wood gray and cracked but holding its shape. Grain dust, 60 years reduced to fine gray powder, had settled into the hopper's lower angles and lifted gently when she breathed near it. She stood in that space for several minutes without moving. Not because there was something specific to see, because of what it meant that it was still here. Someone had built this carefully enough and from good enough materials that 276 years later, in spite of 60 years of neglect and weather, and nothing to stop the slow work of time, it was still standing, still recognizable as what it had been, still arranged in the configuration of a place built to turn raw grain into something a community needed. She thought about the years of mornings someone had walked through this door. The miller at 4 in the morning before customers arrived, checking the machinery, adjusting the gap between the millstones, listening to the sound of the wheel in the water. The farmers who'd come with wagons and left with flour. The mill had been the center of a practical transaction for 2 centuries, the place where raw material became food, and there was a specific gravity to buildings that had served that function for that long. They felt like places that remembered being necessary. She came back down and walked the perimeter of the ground floor. East wall, west wall, both solid. The north wall she pressed her palm against in 2 places, feeling the slight give of loose mortar under the surface in one spot. No second door, no hatch she hadn't accounted for. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the millstones and tried to estimate how many people had passed through this single room over the 2 centuries it operated, had left grain and come back for flour, had made this building the center of a daily transaction that kept families fed through the winters of 200 years. Dorothy was outside when Clara came through the door, moving along the north wall, inspecting the mill race with her hands in her pockets against the cold. When she heard Clara, she pointed toward the wheel housing. "The channel's solid for most of its run," Dorothy said. "That 15-foot section that failed is reparable. Someone with time and a hand truck." She paused. "But look at this." The wheel housing was a curved stone alcove extending from the mill's north wall. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Built to hold the wooden axle that connected the wheel to the interior grinding mechanism and to direct water flow around the wheel's base. At the base of the housing, where the curved alcove met the main foundation, the lowest course of stones was different. Clara knelt. The rest of the foundation was the same blue-gray granite as the mill's walls, rough cut and set with mortar that had dried to the color of old bone. But here, running perhaps 8 linear feet along the base of the wheel housing alcove, the foundation course was a different stone entirely. Darker, closer to black in the shadow of the housing overhang, and the surface not rough-cut but smooth, almost dressed, the way stone looks when someone has worked it with a chisel over many hours rather than splitting it along a natural fracture plane. What drew her eye more than the color was the jointing. Every other joint in the mill's construction had the visible gaps and mortar of hand-built masonry, the slight irregularities that come from working with unequal stones. These joints were hairline thin. She pulled her glove off and pressed her bare fingertip along one seam. She couldn't work a fingernail into it. The stones were fitted against each other with a tolerance that would have been notable even with modern equipment, and was something else entirely for 1743 by hand alone. "No mortar," she said. "I see that," Dorothy said, crouching beside her. "These were cut to fit this precisely, or sorted for months until you had pieces that matched this well. Either way, someone put significant time into this section." Clara moved her finger to a second seam. Same result. For a foundation course that no one sees, that serves no structural purpose the rest of the foundation doesn't already serve. Dorothy sat back on her heels. "And it's here, at the wheel housing, the one part of the building where the water and the wheel would cover the sound of working on the foundation." Clara looked at her. "I'm noting it," Dorothy said. Clara took the flashlight from her pocket and pointed the beam along the section of dark stones. The joints ran not only horizontally between courses, but also vertically, forming a regular grid across the face of the section. And in the corner where the wheel housing curved into the main foundation wall, at the lowest point of the section, there was a recessed area, maybe 20 inches wide, 15 inches tall, set back from the plane of the surrounding stones by roughly 2 inches. A panel shape, as deliberate as a door frame cut into a wall. At the center of the face of each stone in the recessed section was a small notch. Cut, not worn. 1/4 inch deep and 1/2 inch wide, positioned precisely at the midpoint of each stone's length. The notches were too uniform, too consistent in their placement. Across 6 stones. Same depth, same position, same profile on each one. They were grip points, intended for fingers, or for a specific narrow tool. Someone had cut notches into these stones to make them grippable and removable, which meant there was a reason to remove them, which meant there was something on the other side. Dorothy, Clara said. Dorothy was already looking at the notches. Her expression had the quality of someone revising a prior position without announcing it. Those are cut, she said. Yes. Same position on each one. Same profile. Yes. Someone made these removable while making them look like foundation stonework from a distance. Someone who intended to come back. Dorothy put her bare finger against the nearest notch, felt the cut edge. This isn't weathering. This isn't structural. Someone built a door here that looks like a wall. Clara put the flat edge of the crowbar into the first notch and pulled, gently, testing for movement before applying real pressure. The stone held for a moment against 2 centuries of compressed earth and small organic matter in the seams. She adjusted the crowbar's angle. Pulled again with more deliberate force. The stone moved. Not with the crack and fragment of old mortar giving way, not with any violence at all. Cleanly. It rotated slightly inward on a balance point built into its fitted position, then came forward and out of the wall the way a book slides from a tightly packed shelf when you tilt it toward you. She set it on the ground to her left. Behind the stone was darkness. Not the shallow darkness of packed earth a few inches back. The kind that extended. She put the flashlight into the gap, and the beam traveled into it, and found nothing within its range. She removed a second stone, then a third. The opening was now wide enough to reach her arm into. She reached in. Cool air brushed her hand. Absolutely still, the quality of enclosure that develops only in spaces sealed for a very long time. She removed 3 more stones, working methodically, setting each one to her left in the order it had come out. The opening was now roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall. She brought the flashlight up and pointed the beam directly into the gap, parallel to the chamber floor. The chamber ran 4 feet into the earth before the beam found anything. Then 6. Then 8. Then the beam diffused at the edge of its practical range, spreading into general illumination rather than a directed point. The walls were the same dark stone as the exterior course, fitted with the same precision. No mortar, the joints invisible. The ceiling was the underside of the mill's stone floor above, which meant the chamber ran below the full footprint of the building. Not a crawl space, not a narrow cavity, a real room, built with intention, built by someone who expected it to need to hold things for a long time. On the floor of the chamber, at the far edge of the flashlight's reach, were shapes. Stacked and organized, not scattered, not the random accumulation of things forgotten in a dark space. Arranged the way provisions are set on shelves or cargo in a ship's hold, by someone who intended to be able to locate specific items in specific positions. She moved the beam slowly, trying to resolve the shapes into something identifiable. The nearest stack was roughly 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, the profile of flat rectangular objects laid horizontally, one on top of the next. Flat and dense, not hollow. The darkness and distance made surface detail impossible, but the way those stacked shapes sat told her something about their weight. The total compression of them settled completely and permanently into the stone floor, the stability of objects that have been in one position long enough to become part of it. She moved the beam right. Another stack, different profile. Taller, narrower. The shape at the top of it was rounder, less angular, suggesting something wrapped or bagged rather than cased. Beside that, a row of smaller objects set on their sides, the profile consistent from one to the next, the regularity of objects sorted and organized before being stored. Then more of the flat, dense stacks. Then the beam reached its limit and the far wall was still invisible in the dark. She held the light steady on the nearest stack for a long time, breathing the cold, still air that came through the opening. The air itself told her something. Cold and mineral and completely still, the air of a sealed space, but not damp. Not the wet cold of a flooded basement or a water-damaged structure. Dry cold, preserved cold, the temperature of deep earth held constant beneath the insulating weight of stone and soil. Whatever was in the chamber had been kept in conditions that were almost archival. Cool, dark, dry, undisturbed. 241 years of those conditions. She thought about the year 1778. About a merchant who had understood that military advances meant property searches, that soldiers looking for supplies or valuables rarely left a structure unexamined, and that the only hiding place that worked was the one nobody thought to look for. You did not hide things in a secret room behind the house. You built the secret room into the structure itself, in the part nobody had reason to examine closely, below the foundation, at the base of the wheel housing where the noise of water and wool covered the sound of construction, where the stone was thick and the joints were invisible and the notches on the grip stones were too small and too deliberate for anyone looking casually to understand what they meant. You built it in 1743 when you built the mill, because Ezekiel Alderman had understood in 1743 that a prosperous merchant needed a place the world couldn't reach. And then in 1778 you put whatever you had into it, and sealed the wall back up and stayed at your mill while the British advance moved through the valley, because you were not fleeing and you were not brave, you were guarding something, and you needed to be there to do it. Clara pulled the flashlight back and looked at Dorothy. Dorothy had been watching her face rather than the opening, and her expression was unlike anything Clara had seen on her in 30 years of knowing her. Not surprise, a careful stillness. The stillness of a person holding very still because moving might alter something that shouldn't be altered yet. There's a chamber, Clara said, below the mill floor, at least 20 feet deep, maybe more. I can't see the far wall. Dorothy said nothing. There are things in it, Clara said. Stacked. Organized. Multiple distinct stacks, arranged by someone who expected to be able to find specific things in specific positions. The nearest stack has flat, dense objects, heavy ones, laid horizontally. Others have different profiles. Whatever is in there has been sealed in that air for a very long time, and it's been in good condition for most of it. She paused. She was trying to find language for what she'd seen, and the language kept falling short of the thing itself. Not because the thing was indescribable, but because she was still inside the first seconds of understanding what it meant, and first seconds were always the hardest to put into words. The air is dry, she said. Not damp. It's been sealed well enough that the humidity hasn't reached it in any meaningful way. 241 years and whatever is in that chamber has been sitting in conditions that are almost archival. Dorothy exhaled slowly through her nose. She reached into the bag, poured coffee from the thermos into 2 cups, and handed one to Clara. Clara took it. They sat on their heels in the cold March morning, in front of an opening in a foundation wall that had been sealed since before either of their grandmothers was born. We need a lawyer before we touch anything else in there, Dorothy said. Yes. And someone who knows what they're looking at. A historian, or an archaeologist. Someone qualified to say what it is. Yes. And a much bigger flashlight. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup. The coffee was hot enough to feel through Daniel's coat. I know what's in there, she said. I don't know the specifics yet, but I know what Ezekiel Alderman was protecting in 1778. Dorothy looked at her. You don't know that. A prosperous merchant stays at his property during a British military advance. He builds a sealed chamber below his foundation in 1743 with notched gripstones and fitted dry-laid walls and enough room to hold multiple stacks of heavy objects. He dies in 1791 having apparently told nobody about any of it, because if he'd told someone, someone would have come back for it. Clara paused. He either planned to come back himself and didn't, or he told no one because he didn't trust anyone with what was in there. Either way, it's been sitting in this ground for 241 years. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. The creek ran on the other side of the mill. A bird called once somewhere in the trees above the channel and went silent. Call the lawyer first, Dorothy said, before you come back here, before you go any further into that chamber. I will. Today, not tomorrow. Today. Dorothy stood, brushed earth from her knees, and looked at the opening in the foundation wall one more time. The expression on her face had fully replaced whatever skepticism she'd arrived with. She didn't say what replaced it. She didn't need to. They walked back to the car. Clara turned at the gate and looked at the mill once more before getting in. The wheel against the stone wall, the creek running behind it, the March light falling clean and specific across the blue-gray granite. The wheel's iron framework held its shape with the patience of iron that has nothing left to prove. 241 years of that same creek running past the same stones while the mill kept its secret below the millstones, below the packed earth floor, below the carefully fitted dark granite of Ezekiel Alderman's foundation. What are you thinking right now? Dorothy said from the passenger's side, watching her. Clara looked at the mill for another moment. I'm thinking that Daniel knew. Not what was in there. He couldn't have known what was in there. But he knew there was something about this property that was worth knowing about. He read about it, and he kept it, and he never did anything with the information, but he kept it for 3 years. And I'm thinking I want to understand why. Dorothy looked at the mill too. You think he suspected? I think he had a feeling. The way he had feelings about things. He never said so, never wrote it down anywhere I can find. But he kept the page. She got in the car. That's enough. She had a lawyer to call, and a 14-acre property with a crumbling historic mill and a sealed chamber below its foundation, and $200 she no longer had, and a son in Charlotte who was going to need to hear this today because she was not keeping this from Owen any longer than she had to. She drove the 9 miles back to Harlow's Creek and went inside and called her lawyer before she took Daniel's coat off. Clara called Neil Foster at 7:15 that evening, standing at Daniel's desk with the auction receipt still on the blotter in front of her. Foster had been her attorney for 12 years, had handled Daniel's estate, and had the quality she'd always relied on in him, which was that he listened completely before he said anything at all. She told him everything. The drive out to the mill, Dorothy's observation about the mill race stones, the recessed panel section at the wheel housing, the notch cuts, the hairline jointing, removing the 6 stones, the flashlight, the chamber extending 20 feet or more beneath the mill floor, the stacks she'd seen. When she finished, Foster was quiet for a moment. The stones moved cleanly, he said. No mortar breaking. None. They came out like they'd been placed to be moved. And the air in there. You said dry. Cold and dry. Not damp at all. Like a wine cellar that hasn't been opened. Another silence. Clara, I need to ask you directly. Are you telling me you found a sealed underground chamber, built in 1743, containing organized stacks of objects, on a property you legally own, that the county has held title to since 2003 and been trying to sell for 16 years? Yes. He exhaled through his nose, the sound of a careful man doing arithmetic. And you haven't moved anything. We took out 6 foundation stones to make the opening. Everything inside is exactly where it was. Good. Don't touch anything else until I've spoken to someone. He paused. I know a woman at the University of Virginia, Patricia Holt. She holds the Bancroft Chair in Colonial American History. She's published extensively on Revolutionary War-era concealment practices. If what you're describing is what I think you're describing, Patricia is the person you need on-site before you go any further. Can she come quickly? I'll call her tonight. She won't say no to this. Clara hung up and stood for a moment looking at the bird feeder in the dark window. No birds at this hour. The feeder turning slightly in a breeze she couldn't feel from inside the house. She called Owen. She didn't tell him everything. She told him she'd found something at the mill that needed professional assessment and that she was working with Foster on it and that everything was fine. Owen heard the specific calibration in her voice. The way she was choosing words with more care than the situation she was describing appeared to require. What did you find? He said. I found something interesting. Mom, what did you find? I'll tell you when I know what I'm looking at. I have people coming out to assess it. A few days. I'm going to drive up, he said. Owen, you have work. I can work remotely. I'll drive up Saturday. She didn't argue. After she hung up, she sat for a long time at Daniel's desk without turning on the overhead light. Just the desk lamp, a small circle of yellow, the rest of the room in evening shadow. The printout from Daniel's interesting box was in the desk drawer. She pulled it out and read it again. The history of the mill. The date it was built. Ezekiel Alderman, 1712 to 1791. 30 years from the building of the mill to his death. Time enough to decide whether the cash beneath the floor was something to retrieve or something to leave. Time enough for circumstances to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd died in 1791 and the cash had stayed. She put the printout back in the drawer and went to bed. Foster called at 8 the following morning. Dr. Holt had been reached and was driving from Charlottesville on Thursday. She'd wanted to come Wednesday, but had a graduate seminar she couldn't cancel. Foster would meet them at the property at 9. Dorothy appeared at the door at 9:30 the same morning, before Foster had called. She came in, sat at the table, accepted coffee, and said nothing for a moment, which was unusual for Dorothy. When she spoke, her voice had the careful quality of someone who had thought a great deal about what they were going to say. I looked up Ezekiel Alderman last night, Dorothy said. So did I. The county history footnote you found. I found it too, and then I found something else. There's a secondary source from 1912, a history of Valley Forge supply routes written by a professor at William and Mary. He mentions Alderman once, briefly, as one of several Shenandoah Valley merchants who were known to have provided goods to the Continental Army through irregular channels in 1778. Dorothy put her cup down. He calls Alderman a man of considerable resource and even more considerable discretion. That phrase, considerable discretion. Clara looked at her. A merchant who supplied the Continental Army through irregular channels in 1778 would have been doing something close to smuggling goods past British lines, Dorothy said. He'd have had continental dollars, foreign coin, gold from trade. He'd have had goods he couldn't store in his house without risk of discovery. And he'd have been exactly the kind of man who thought about what to do with those assets if the British came to his property. She picked up her coffee again. I'm not saying I know what's in there. I'm saying I've spent 30 years as a county archivist. I know what considerable discretion means about a man of that period. They're coming Thursday, Clara said. A historian from UVA. My attorney. Will you come? Dorothy considered as though she had other plans to weigh, though Clara was reasonably sure she didn't. 9 o'clock. 9. Thursday was cool and clear, the kind of March morning that hadn't decided whether to stay cold or turn toward spring. Clara arrived at the Alderman Mill at 8:45 and sat in her car until she heard Foster's vehicle on the gravel track. He arrived at 8:50 with Dr. Patricia Holt in the passenger seat. Dr. Holt was 54, compact and direct, with close-cut silver hair and the brisk movement of someone who had spent decades working in spaces that required moving carefully. She carried a canvas bag that held, Clara would see, 2 high-powered lanterns, a measuring tape, a camera, a set of brushes in graduated sizes, a small notebook, and latex gloves in several sizes. She'd come prepared. She shook Clara's hand when she got out of the car, looked at the mill for about 3 seconds, and said, "Which side?" "North face. The wheel housing." "Show me." Dorothy arrived as they were walking toward the mill. Foster made introductions. Dr. Holt nodded at Dorothy with the recognition of one professional acknowledging another's presence without needing a biography. Clara had brought better equipment than she and Dorothy had managed on their first 2 visits. 2 lanterns of her own, borrowed from a camping supply store in Woodstock the previous day. A crowbar and the cold chisel from Daniel's toolbox. She'd spent the night before thinking about exactly which stones to remove and in what order to make the opening large enough for a person to pass through without requiring acrobatic contortion. At the wheel housing, Dr. Holt set down her bag, crouched, and looked at the dark stone section without speaking for about 30 seconds. She put on a pair of latex gloves. She ran her bare fingertip along one joint seen the way Clara had on the first visit. Same result. Nothing. Dry laid, Dr. Holt said. Yes. No mortar anywhere in the section. The stone type is different from the surrounding foundation. This is a finer granite. High silica content. You'd have to source it specifically. She sat back on her heels and looked at the full extent of the section. The notch cuts on the grip points are consistent with a stonemason's work from the mid-18th century. The profile of the cut is from a specific type of chisel that went out of common use before 1820. She looked at Clara. Someone who knew what they were doing built this. Not a mill owner. A craftsman hired for this specific purpose, who would have been paid well enough to keep his mouth shut. "Do you want to go in?" Clara said. Dr. Holt stood up. "Yes. Let's remove the stones." It took 40 minutes to open the entrance properly. Clara removed the existing 6-stone opening, then expanded it upward and to the right, extracting 14 more stones. Each one came out cleanly, the same way the first 6 had, pivoting out of their positions without resistance, without mortar breaking, without the structural protest you'd expect from disturbing a foundation wall. Each one placed carefully on the ground in order, a grid of dark granite that would need to go back in the same positions. The opening was now 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Enough for a person to pass through without crouching much. Dr. Holt handed lanterns to Foster and Clara, kept one for herself, pulled her bag over her shoulder, and went through first. The air that came through the opening when the stones were removed was the same as Clara had felt before, cold and mineral and absolutely still. The smell of enclosed stone that had been enclosed for a very long time. No organic decay, no moisture, no animal presence. The air of a sealed place. Dr. Holt stepped into the chamber and turned slowly, sweeping her lantern in a full arc. The chamber was roughly 22 feet deep and 14 feet wide. Clara could see now with proper lighting. Stone walls on 3 sides, dry-laid with the same precision as the entrance, each joint hairline thin. The ceiling was the underside of the mill's stone floor, supported by granite crosspieces that formed a shallow arch. Someone had engineered the structural load carefully enough that 241 years of mill equipment operating on the floor above had not shifted the ceiling a millimeter. The floor was flagstone, also fitted without mortar, also level. Along the 3 walls were the contents. North wall, 2 rows of rectangular shapes, wrapped in what Dr. Holt identified immediately as oilskin, the waterproofing material of the period, applied in multiple layers and tied with cord that had dried to wire stiffness but had not broken. The shapes were flat and dense, laid horizontally in stacks of 4 or 5, the stacks themselves arranged edge to edge along the wall's full 14-foot length. East wall, wooden crates, 6 of them, each roughly the size of a small steamer trunk, constructed from a dense hardwood and sealed at every seam with what appeared to be lead, the gray-black color of old lead, applied in a bead around each joint. On the face of each crate, a stamped marking, 2 or 3 characters, too small to read without the loop. South wall, leather sacks, dozens of them, tied at the neck, stacked in 2 rows that ran the full length of the wall. The leather had dried and contracted over 200 years and taken on a color that was neither brown nor black, but something between them, the color of very old things that have been in cold, dark air since before anyone now alive was born. And in the far corner of the east wall, separate from the crates, a wooden case, roughly the size of a document box, fitted with brass hardware that had turned green over time but was structurally intact, closed with a brass latch. On the lid, burned into the wood in a hand that had taken care with the letters, a name. E. Alderman. Dr. Holt stood in the center of the chamber for a long moment, not moving, her lantern steady. She had the quality that Clara had seen in skilled people working at the edge of their expertise, the stillness of someone who is doing the most important thing they've ever done and knows it. The chamber's temperature, she noted from a small gauge she'd brought in her bag, was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The relative humidity reading was 23%. She wrote both numbers down. Those numbers mattered. They were the numbers that explained why everything in this room was in the condition it was in. Most things fail because of moisture. Wood rots, metal corrodes, leather degrades, paper crumbles. The chemistry of decay needs water to proceed, and water needs either a water source or sufficient humidity in the air. This chamber had had neither for 241 years. The deep earth insulation had kept the temperature constant, which prevented condensation cycles. The sealed stone walls had prevented groundwater infiltration. Ezekiel Alderman had understood, intuitively or by design, that the preservation of whatever he placed in this room depended not on any special treatment, but on the simple removal of moisture and temperature variation, both of which the earth provided freely to anyone who built deep enough and sealed tight enough. He had built deep enough. He had sealed tight enough. The crates are lead sealed, she said, her voice professional and even. That's an unusual preservation method for this period. Expensive and labor-intensive. You used it when you needed to protect contents from moisture over an indeterminate period. Someone was planning for the long term. She walked toward the north wall, crouched, looked at the nearest oilskin-wrapped package. May I? Clara looked at Foster. Carefully, Foster said. Dr. Holt set her lantern on the floor, took a narrow brush from her bag, and very gently brushed dust from the corner of the nearest oilskin package. The surface beneath the dust was the dark olive gray of oilskin, the waterproofing material still visibly intact after 200 years of cold, dry air. At the corner of the package, where the oilskin had been folded and tied rather than sealed flat, a small section of the package's actual content was visible. Dr. Holt brought her loop from her bag and looked at it. 30 seconds of silence. This is gold, she said. Flat. Factual. The way you say something when you've been around enough rare objects to know immediately what you're looking at. Nobody spoke. The corner exposure shows a refined metal surface with the specific yellow of high-purity gold. Not an alloy. The density of these packages is consistent with gold bullion bars of the period, which typically ran between 10 and 25 pounds each. She stood up and looked at the full length of the north wall, counted the stacks silently, counted the layers, looked at Clara. If this is representative, and if I'm reading the arrangement correctly, there may be 150 to 200 individual bars here. Foster said, very quietly, Patricia. I know, she said. She moved to the south wall, crouched in front of the nearest leather sack. The cord at its neck had dried to something close to wire. She didn't cut it. She photographed it. Then she photographed the full arrangement of the sacks, working systematically with the camera, working left to right, documenting the position of each sack before she touched anything. Then she carefully lifted the nearest sack and tested its weight in both hands. Heavy, she said. Dense. Consistent with coin. She set it back exactly where it had been. I'd want a conservator to open these properly. But I can tell you from the weight distribution and the way they were stored, they weren't stored this way to hold common currency. You don't store common currency in individual sealed sacks in a lead-sealed underground chamber. You store this way when you're protecting things of significant individual value. She moved to the east wall and the crates. Close up, the stampings on the face of each crate were clearer under the lantern's direct light. A crown. Below the crown, a series of letters and numbers. Below that, a secondary mark, a different character set. Dr. Holt looked at the marks for a long time without touching the crates. She photographed each one individually, moving her lantern to different angles to catch the stamped impressions in relief, the way you needed to position light to see surface markings on objects that had been in the dark for 2 centuries. The stampings were deep enough to have survived without erosion, which told her something about the care of the original marking and the consistency of conditions in the chamber. Whatever tools had made these marks had made them to last. Foster asked what the lead sealing process had required. She described it without looking away from the crates. Molten lead applied along each joint while the wood was hot, the lead cooling and contracting into a bead that sealed moisture out with more reliability than any caulk or resin of the period. The process required a craftsman who knew metalwork. The same craftsman, probably, who had fitted the chamber stones with hairline jointing. A hired specialist. One transaction, an alderman had bought 241 years of preservation. The crown mark and the letter form below it are consistent with British assay marks from the 1760s, she said. The secondary mark is different. That's a merchant's mark, personal to an individual trader. She took the small notebook from her bag, opened it to a page she'd apparently prepared before arriving, held it up next to the crate face. I pulled Alderman's known merchant mark from the county deed records before I drove out this morning. This is it. Clara looked at the notebook page, at the mark on the crate. They matched. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Ezekiel Alderman, Clara said. Yes. Foster spoke from near the entrance, where he'd been standing and photographing everything with his phone. What are we looking at in terms of the document case? Dr. Holt walked to the far corner, crouched in front of the brass-fitted wooden case. She photographed it from 4 angles. She examined the brass latch without touching it. She ran a gloved finger along the hinge line. The wood had shrunk slightly over 2 centuries, the joint's hairline gapped, but the structure was sound. I won't open it today, she said. This needs a paper conservator present. Whatever is inside, if it's paper documents or account books from 1778, the exposure to any change in humidity or temperature without proper preparation could cause irreversible damage in the first 30 seconds. She stood up and looked at the name burned into the lid. E. Alderman. He knew this was here. He put his name on it. That's either instructions or a record of what he hid, or both. They spent another 40 minutes in the chamber. Dr. Holt photographed everything, documented dimensions, took air temperature readings, 54 degrees Fahrenheit, which she noted was remarkably consistent with deep storage conditions, and made written notes in her small notebook in the precise hand of a person who has spent decades recording things that other people would later depend on having recorded correctly. She did not remove anything from the chamber. When they came out and stood in the March air by the wheel housing, there was a quality to the silence that Clara recognized from the only other time in her life she'd experienced a comparable silence, which was the moment she'd understood Daniel was gone. The silence of a circumstance too large for immediate language. Foster spoke first. He was a measured man, a careful man. and he chose his words with the attention of someone who understood that what he said in the next several minutes would be referred back to later. "Patricia," he said, "I need you to tell me what we're looking at. Not in technical terms. In plain terms." Dr. Holt looked at the mill, then at Clara, then at Foster. "In plain terms, you have a sealed underground cache from approximately 1778, placed here by a colonial-era merchant named Ezekiel Alderman, who had the means and the knowledge to preserve it for an indefinite period. The cache contains what appear to be gold bullion bars in the range of 150 to 200 units, a large collection of coin that would require individual examination to quantify, a set of sealed crates of unknown contents that are large enough to hold additional coin or goods of significant value, and a document case that almost certainly contains records in Alderman's hand explaining what's here and why it's here." She paused. "The gold bars alone, at current spot price, if there are 150 of them at £20 each, are in the range of $100 million. That's before you factor in the historical premium. Pre-revolutionary gold of this provenance, this quantity, this condition would command a substantial premium above spot price at auction. Then the coins. A single rare continental coin in this condition, depending on the variety, can sell at auction for between $500,000 and $7 million. If there are 500 coins in those sacks, and if even 10% of them are extremely rare varieties, you're looking at a collection that numismatic experts would spend years evaluating." She looked at Clara. "I want to be measured about this. I don't want to give you a number that turns out to be wrong and does damage in either direction. But you asked me to be plain, so I'll be plain. This is the most significant colonial-era material discovery in American history. The monetary valuation is secondary to that, but the monetary valuation is also very large." The creek ran on the other side of the mill. A red-tailed hawk appeared above the tree line to the south, circled twice, disappeared. Clara said, "What do we do next?" Foster had already been thinking through this in the way of a lawyer who is always running the procedural track in parallel with everything else. "You own the property. Whatever was concealed in this property at the time it passed to county ownership in 2003 became county property. But the county sold you the property with all contents, which is standard language in tax-lien auction sales. I'll need to review the deed language carefully, but my preliminary read is that contents follow the property, which means this is yours." "You're sure?" Clara said. "I'll spend this weekend on the research and give you a formal opinion on Monday. But as of right now, we proceed on the assumption that you own this." He paused. "Clara, I also need you to understand what happens next procedurally. We need a paper conservator and a numismatic specialist here before anything is touched. We need a full photographic and written documentation of the chamber contents before any removal. We need to notify the State Historical Preservation Office because this is a site of historical significance, and failure to do so correctly could create complications later. And we need to be very careful about who we tell and what we say until the ownership question is formally settled." "Raymond Voss," Clara said. "Among others. The moment this becomes publicly known, you will have considerable pressure from considerable directions. I want to have your legal position absolutely solid before that happens." They walked back to the cars. Dr. Holt stopped at the mill door and looked at it for a moment before leaving. Clara noticed she was looking at something specific and turned to follow her gaze. Above the main door, cut into the granite lintel, 3 letters. Worn with age and the particular erosion of stone that has been exposed to weather while everything around it was sealed and protected, but visible now that she was looking directly at them. She hadn't noticed them on any of her previous visits, which meant either she hadn't been looking at the right angle or the morning light hadn't hit the lintel at the correct oblique angle to make the shallow carvings readable. They were not meant to be prominent. They were meant to be findable. There was a difference. W-I-S. "What does that mean?" Dorothy said, standing beside her. Dr. Holt looked at the letters for a moment. She reached up and ran her gloved fingertip across them, feeling the depth of the cuts and the profile of the chisel work. "I don't know yet," she said. "But Ezekiel Alderman carved everything with intention. I'd like to know what intention this one had." Clara looked at the letters. W-I-S. 3 consonants, no vowels, which in the conventions of 18th century abbreviation could mean several things. Initials, a phrase, a word with the vowels dropped. the way a mason might abbreviate a family motto or a merchant's code carved into stone where space was limited and permanence was required. She thought about Daniel's printout, filed between the millstone article and the provisioning history. She thought about what kind of man kept a piece of information for 3 years without acting on it, trusting that when the moment arrived he would recognize it. She thought that W.I.S. might stand for something very simple. She didn't say it aloud yet. That evening, Owen arrived from Charlotte. He'd driven the 3.5 hours after his last meeting of the day, arriving at Clara's house at 6:15 with his bag in the car and the particular expression he wore when he was trying to appear less worried than he was. Clara had not told him what they'd found. She'd said come up and she'd explain when he arrived. He sat at the kitchen table while Dorothy poured coffee she'd made when she heard his car in the driveway, because Dorothy had taken to appearing at Clara's house at intervals that were not quite constant but were more frequent than they'd been in the 11 months since Daniel died, and this evening seemed to warrant her presence. Clara told Owen everything. She told it in order: the auction, the first visit, the foundation stones, the recessed panel, the notch cuts, removing the stones, and finding the chamber. Dr. Holt. Today, Owen listened the way he'd learned to listen in finance, which was without interrupting and without visible reaction, because interrupting closed off information and visible reaction gave the other person permission to stop. He sat with both hands around his coffee mug and let her talk. When she finished, he asked for questions. How many gold bars? Estimated. Between 150 and 200. How many coin sacks? Approximately 40, stacked in 2 rows. What was the basis for Dr. Holt's identification of the coin type? Her direct examination with a loop-in chamber, plus her published expertise in colonial material culture. And was the ownership question truly settled? Foster says yes, pending formal review of the deed language, which he'll complete by Monday. Owen sat with those answers for about 30 seconds. 150 bars, he said. At minimum. Could be 200. At 20 pounds each. That was Dr. Holt's estimate for the average weight. Owen looked at his coffee. Looked at Clara. You bought this property for $200. Yes. He exhaled. It was the only response he had that was proportional to what he'd just been told. Dorothy said nothing, which was the clearest indication Clara had that Dorothy found the situation equal to the silence. You need to call me every day, Owen said. Not to ask permission, just to tell me what's happening. I can help with the financial structure of what comes after this. That's literally what I do. I know. And Mom, you cannot tell anyone else until Foster has the ownership question formally settled. I know that too. He sat for another moment, looking at his coffee. He was a man who worked in finance and understood large numbers as tools, as abstractions, as quantities to be modeled and projected and allocated. He dealt in millions routinely and had long since trained himself not to feel the size of a number the same way a person who hadn't spent years handling such numbers would feel it. But sitting in his mother's kitchen on a Friday evening in March, hearing her describe what a colonial historian and a lawyer had confirmed that afternoon in the chamber beneath a 14-acre property she'd bought for $200 11 months after his father died, the size of the thing broke through the training. He felt it plainly, the way you feel something when the context strips away every professional buffer you've built. His father had kept a printout about this property for 3 years. His mother had spent everything in her checking account on a county auction minimum bid and won on the only morning no one else had bid. She'd walked into the mill with a flashlight and her neighbor and found the most significant colonial-era discovery in American history underneath the floor. Daniel would have. Owen started. Stopped. Started again. He would have loved this. The whole thing. He would have spent the next year reading everything ever written about Ezekiel Alderman. Clara smiled, for the first time in several days. I know. He would have read it all, and then explained most of it back to you while you were trying to watch something on television. I know that too. They sat quietly for a moment, Dorothy making herself useful at the sink in the particular way of someone who has been friends with a person long enough to know that being present in a room does not always require contributing to the conversation. He'd noticed the cars at the Alderman Mill property on Tuesday, the day after Clara's first visit with Dorothy. He'd driven past it twice over the following days, once in the evening when Clara's car was there alone, and once in the morning when he'd seen Dorothy's sedan on the gravel track. He'd thought nothing specific of it. A widow who'd bought an abandoned property at a county auction might well be visiting it repeatedly. But Thursday's activity was different. 3 vehicles on the gravel track. People going in and out. Someone carrying professional equipment. He could see that from the road. Not construction equipment. Different. Raymond had built his business on information. He knew most of what happened in Shenandoah County before it became general knowledge, partly because he'd cultivated relationships with county staff over 20 years, and partly because he paid attention to things that other people dismissed as ordinary. A widow with a professional-looking visitor at a property Raymond had watched for 16 years was not, in Raymond's assessment, ordinary. He'd called the county assessor's office Friday morning, on the pretext of verifying the deed transfer paperwork. The woman he spoke to mentioned, helpfully, that Clara Marsh had also been in touch with the State Historical Preservation Office the previous afternoon, which Raymond received as confirmation of something he'd been calculating since Thursday. He'd driven to Clara's house Friday evening. She answered the door. He could see Owen behind her in the kitchen, standing at the counter. The presence of her son at 7 in the evening on a Friday, when Charlotte was 3.5 hours away, told Raymond something additional. He said what he'd come to say, which was framed as neighborly concern but was actually a probe for information. She gave him nothing. When he mentioned the archaeologist, she gave him even less. She closed the door with the courtesy of a woman who was not angry but was also not going to be maneuvered. He walked back to his car and sat for a moment in the dark, engine off, doing the calculation that was available to him with the information he had. The State Historical Preservation Office. An archaeologist. A visit that lasted most of the day. A son who drove 3.5 hours on a Friday. A widow who'd bought a derelict mill property for $200 and turned down $500 the same day. Raymond Voss was a man who had made his career on knowing when a property was worth more than its price. He'd built 20 years of commercial development on a single operating principle. That other people's inability to see past the obvious created opportunities for those who looked at what the obvious was concealing. He'd bought 3 properties over the years that other developers had passed on, each time because he'd identified something in the property records or the land surveys or the historical assessment reports that the other developers had skimmed over and he had read with more attention. He started his car. He drove home slowly, thinking about what you found in it. Old Stone Mill, if you were a colonial historian, and you stayed most of a day and left with the expression of someone who'd seen something that required careful management. He thought about the $500 offer he'd made in the parking lot after the auction. He thought about how quickly Clara Marsh had declined it without asking why he'd gone up from 0 to 500. He thought about the very specific quality of her refusal, which was not the refusal of a person who couldn't use the money but the refusal of a person who already understood, on some level she couldn't yet articulate, that the thing she'd purchased was worth more than anything he was likely to offer. He'd underestimated her. That thought was irritating, and Raymond Voss did not enjoy being irritated. He preferred to channel irritation into information gathering, which was the most productive thing you could do with it. He started thinking about what he could still do from this position. Saturday morning Dr. Holt returned, this time bringing a colleague she'd called the previous evening, Dr. Samuel Chun from the Smithsonian's Numismatic Division in Washington, who had driven to Charlottesville that evening and ridden to Harlow's Creek with Dr. Holt before breakfast. Chun was 60, quiet, and wore thin cotton gloves he'd brought in a sealed case. He said nothing during the drive out to the mill that Dr. Holt mentioned later, except to ask once how the coins had been stored. When they stood before the first open leather sack, carefully supported on a clean cloth that Dr. Holt had spread on the chamber floor, Chun put on his gloves and took out the first coin he touched with the care of a man who had spent 40 years handling things that were irreplaceable. He held it under the lantern. He turned it. He looked at the obverse, then the reverse. He set it down gently on the cloth, picked up a second one, turned it, set it down, picked up a third. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Clara, standing near the chamber entrance, found herself watching his face rather than the coins, because his face was the more legible instrument. He was not a man who showed much, but she had been watching people process difficult information for most of her adult life, and she could see the precise moment when he moved from examining the coins in front of him to understanding what the coins in front of him meant about the coins in the other 39 sacks. He set down the third coin, picked up a fourth, looked at it under the loupe for an unusually long time. The loupe pressed against his eye. the coin held steady in both gloved hands. Set it down with extraordinary care, the way you set something down when its fragility is not about the object, but about the thing the object represents. Patricia, he said, there's a 1787 Brasher doubloon here. Clara didn't know what that meant, but she could see from the way both Dr. Holt and Foster went very still that it meant something large. How many? Dr. Holt said. Chen looked back at the contents of the open sack, still spread on the cloth. He counted, recounted. From this sack alone, I'm looking at what appears to be for Brasher doubloons. His voice was completely level. The voice of a man who has trained himself, over 40 years, not to let his voice do what his body wanted his voice to do. The last Brasher doubloon that came to auction sold for $9.36 million. There are estimated to be fewer than 15 in existence. If there are 4 in this one sack, and if there are 40 sacks. He stopped himself. The Continental dollars, he said instead. The 1776 issue. In this condition. He picked up another coin, looked at it, set it down with the same careful deliberateness. This is a type that numismatists consider extremely rare in grades approaching the condition of this example. The last comparable example I'm aware of brought for $1 million at auction. Clara was standing near the entrance to the chamber. She put her hand on the stone wall beside her because it was there and because the cold of the stone was real in a way that was useful at this moment. She thought about Daniel's printout, about $200 in a coat pocket, about a county clerk saying sold. She thought about Ezekiel Alderman carrying his name on a document case, placing it in the corner of a room he'd built below the floor of his mill, a room that had held everything he trusted the earth to hold, through 7 generations of people who'd never known it was there. The earth never lies. That was what she'd thought, standing at the gate before driving away on Thursday. It had risen in her unbidden, those 3 words, and she hadn't known where they came from or why they arrived at that particular moment. She knew now. She'd spent 11 months in the company of a loss she hadn't been prepared for and hadn't had the resources to manage well, and had managed anyway, one day at a time, by making the next reasonable decision and then the one after that. She'd raised her hand in a county parking lot with $200 in a coat pocket and nothing she could point to as a reason except that Daniel had kept a printout for 3 years, and that had seemed like a reason worth honoring. And the earth had held what it had been holding for 241 years, patient and silent and perfectly preserved, waiting for someone to notice the wrong thing. She looked at the chamber, at the walls of dark-fitted stone, at the organized stacks of things that Ezekiel Alderman had trusted to the earth's cold and dark and stillness, trusting them more than he'd trusted any person alive to keep his secret. We need a number, Foster said, from beside her. He was speaking to Chun and Dr. Holt, not to Clara. We can't give you a number yet, Chun said. Not until we've examined every coin individually. Not until the bars are assayed and their provenance is confirmed. Not until the crates are opened with proper conservation. Support. He paused. But I can tell you this. I've spent 40 years in this field. I've never seen anything like what I'm looking at. A range, Foster said. Chun looked at Dr. Holt. A long look that carried information between 2 people who had worked long enough in adjacent fields to speak to each other without much language. A preliminary range, Chin said carefully, based on what I can see without full examination, taking into account current market conditions for comparable material, and assuming the contents of the remaining sacks are at all representative of what I've already seen in this one. He paused. I would not be comfortable saying this outside this room until it's formally supported by assessment. But inside this room, today, based on what I'm looking at, I believe the numismatic collection alone may be the most valuable private coin holding in American history. Outside, the March sun was reaching the point in the sky where it fell at an angle through the mill's east-facing windows, sending bars of light across the stone floor of the room above the chamber where they stood. The creek ran on the other side of the north wall, making the sound it had made for 2.5 centuries, while Ezekiel Alderman's trust held below the foundation. Clara looked at the document case in the corner with Alderman burned into the lid. She thought about what was inside it, not the monetary value of what was inside it, about the man who had put it there, who had built this room and sealed it and stayed at his mill while British forces moved through the valley, who had died in 1791 with this room beneath his feet and either not told anyone, or told someone who had kept the secret so well that it survived 7 generations of owners and a county tax lien and 16 years of failed auction attempts and arrived, in the end, at a $66 printout in a plastic bin with a blue lid. She wanted to know what Ezekiel Alderman had written in that case. She wanted to understand what a man put down on paper when he was sealing it below his foundation, when he was making arrangements for the possibility that he might not return. "When can we open it?" she said. Dr. Holt looked at the case. "The paper conservator I'm thinking of is in Richmond. She could be here Wednesday at the earliest." She paused. "We'll need to control the humidity in the chamber for 48 hours before we attempt opening. The transition from 241-year sealed conditions to current ambient air has to happen gradually, or the paper will be damaged in the first seconds of exposure." "Wednesday," Clara said. "Wednesday." She drove home alone that afternoon with Owen following in his own car. The sun was down to the tree line by the time she pulled into her driveway, and the shadow of the house fell long and blue across the yard and the garden where she'd found Daniel kneeling in the spring earth with a trowel in his hand and his body's business already finished. She sat in her car for a moment before getting out. She looked at the bird feeder. A single chickadee was working the perch in the last of the afternoon light, methodical, patient, unaware of anything but the sunflower seeds and the immediate business of the day. She thought about the W.I.S. carved above the mill door, about what Dr. Holt had said, that Ezekiel Alderman carved everything with intention. She'd asked Foster to pull whatever historical records existed on the full Alderman family genealogy. She didn't know why the letters were there. She had a theory, not ready to be spoken aloud yet. She got out of the car. Owen was behind her. He'd said very little on the drive back. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly as they walked toward the door. "Mom," he said. "I know," she said. "Do you know what this is?" She stopped at the door and thought about the right answer to that question, which was not a simple one. She thought about 11 months of paying bills with bookkeeping income and making mortgage payments that left her account empty and turning over the idea of calling her son for help and not doing it because she wasn't ready. She thought about Daniel's interesting box and what kind of man kept a printout for 3 years without acting on it, and whether that was faith in the idea or patience with his own lack of resources or simply the particular attention that a man who read about things before doing them gave to anything that caught his eye. "I know what it is," she said. "I'm still working out what it means." She went inside. The house smelled like the coffee Dorothy had made that morning and the ordinary accumulated smell of her own life in these rooms, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment before turning on any lights, standing in the last thin light of the day coming through the window above the sink, and she let herself feel what she hadn't let herself feel yet, which was the specific ache of wanting to tell Daniel. She would have called him on the phone if she could. Would have told him calmly at first, the way you tell someone news you're still processing yourself, and then less calmly as his response came back to her through the phone, and then not calmly at all because Daniel would have been incapable of calm in response to what she'd just found, and she loved him for that specific incapacity that he tried always to keep contained and never quite managed. She thought about the printout in his interesting box, about the particular way he'd filed it, between the Millstone article and the provisioning history, which was the filing of a man who understood that these 3 documents belonged together, who had recognized a pattern across 3 separate pieces of information without articulating that recognition to anyone, perhaps not even to himself. Daniel had been a man who thought in systems, who would have looked at an abandoned mill built by a Revolutionary War-era merchant and filed it under. Interesting. Worth knowing about. The kind of thing that might connect to something else someday. He hadn't lived to see what it connected to. She thought about whether she believed in the kind of universe that made connections like this. She thought about that for a minute and then decided it was the wrong question. The right question was simpler. She had raised her hand in a parking lot with $200 in one, and what had been won was real, and what she did with it would be real, and that was enough for tonight. She filled the bird feeder. Then she stood at the window in the dark kitchen while Owen made pasta in the other room and Dorothy's footsteps came across the grass from next door, because Dorothy had apparently decided that this evening required her presence again, and Clara found she was glad. Wednesday was 4 days away. The document case with E. Alderman burned into the lid was 40 feet from the mill's north wall, 8 feet below the surface, in cold that had not changed in 241 years. Clara was going to find out what Ezekiel Alderman had left to say. She thought about this as she lay awake that night. Owen in the guest room down the hall, the house quiet except for the particular settling sounds old houses made in the small hours. She thought about the kind of man who wrote something down before sealing a room. Not a man who assumed silence was enough. A man who wanted to be understood. Who wanted someone, eventually, to know why. She'd spent 11 months trying to understand why Daniel had left when he did, an unanswerable question, the most unanswerable question, because there was no why in a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in April. There was only what happened and what came after. What came after was this. Was the interesting box and the auction receipt and the mill and the chamber and the 4 brasher doubloons in a leather sack and the weight of Ezekiel Alderman's name burned into the lid of a document case that no one had touched in 241 years. What came after was always this. Not an answer. Something else to carry forward. She slept eventually and dreamed of water running through a stone channel. Wednesday came with fog, the kind that settled into creek valleys in early spring and held on until mid-morning. And when Clara drove out to the Alderman Mill at 8:15, the building appeared before her out of the white slowly, stone materializing from mist, the wheel first, and then the roof line, and then the north wall with the mill race beside it, and the wheel housing where she'd removed the first 6 stones 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since she'd crouched at that foundation wall and felt the first stone pivot out of its position. The distance between that morning and this one, measured in events rather than calendar days, was longer than any 3 weeks she could account for. She sat in her car in the fog and thought about that for a moment. The paper conservator's name was Dr. Renata Solis. She'd driven up from Richmond the previous evening and stayed at the bed and breakfast in Woodstock rather than make the drive twice in the same day. Foster had called her a week earlier based on Dr. Holt's recommendation, and she'd rearranged 2 other projects to come, which told Clara something about what Dr. Holt had said to her on the phone. Dr. Solis arrived at 8:40, a compact woman of 60 with reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck and a case the size of a rolling suitcase that contained her equipment. She introduced herself to Clara briefly and then asked to see the chamber before she touched anything, walking the full perimeter of it with a small instrument that measured both humidity and particulate matter in the air. She took 4 readings in different positions. She noted the numbers in a log. Then she asked Foster and Owen, who had both come, to step outside the chamber while she worked. "I'll want Dr. Holt present," she said. "And one other person." Clara stayed. Dr. Solis set up a portable humidity control unit near the entrance, a device about the size of a small humidifier that would raise the chamber's moisture content from 23% to 35% over 4 hours. She explained, to Clara and to nobody in particular, that paper stored in conditions of very low humidity for extended periods would become brittle at the molecular level in a way that was not visible to the eye. A sudden introduction to normal ambient air would cause the paper to expand unevenly, fracturing at the fold lines and along the grain of the paper stock. The 4-hour acclimatization process would allow the fibers to absorb moisture gradually before the document case was opened. "You wait 4 hours, Dr. Solis said. "We wait 4 hours, Clara said. They sat outside the mill in the clearing fog and drank coffee from Dorothy's thermos. Dorothy had brought lunch, too, a practical response to the probability of a long day. Owen sat on a stone from the mill race channel and made calls he kept quiet and brief, handling whatever was pending in Charlotte with the focused efficiency of a man who had rearranged his professional life around a family emergency and was managing the rearrangement competently. Dr. Holt arrived at 10 and went straight into the chamber to check on the humidity unit, came out, looked at the fog lifting above the tree line, and said nothing. She had the quality of a person who had processed most of what needed processing over the past week and arrived this morning in a state of careful readiness. They talked about other things while they waited. Dorothy asked Dr. Holt about her graduate students. Dr. Holt described the paper she was writing. Owen, who had brought his laptop, worked on whatever needed his professional attention that morning. Clara sat on the stone she'd used the first time she'd come with Dorothy and drank coffee and watched the fog burn off the creek valley. In layers, the lower mist lifting first, and then the upper banks clearing, and then the full length of the valley visible in the clean March light. She was thinking about the letter. She didn't know yet what was in it. She had a strong sense of what a man like Ezekiel Alderman would have written, derived from the historical record, from the way he'd built the chamber, from the care of his construction and the specificity of his concealment. A man who built with that precision was a man who thought about consequences before they arrived. He would not have left a sealed document case without knowing what he'd written was adequate. She was thinking about what adequate meant for a man writing in 1778 to whoever might open it next. At 12:40, Dr. Solis went back into the chamber with her instrument. 35%. She noted the number. Then she took from her case a set of tools that looked like surgical instruments. Narrow-tipped forceps, a very small spatula, a brush no wider than a finger, and a set of extremely thin flexible metal sheets, each about 2 inches wide and 6 inches long, that she identified as microspatulas. The document case came out of the chamber on a padded platform Dr. Solis had placed on the stone floor, moved with the lateral deliberateness of someone who understood that the next several minutes would either succeed or fail based on the quality of the preparation that had preceded them. She examined the brass latch under her glasses for 30 seconds. It had not been sealed, only latched. The brass had oxidized to green-gray, but the mechanism was intact, the latch turning when she applied careful lateral pressure with her gloved fingertip. Before she opened it, she photographed the exterior on all 4 sides and the top and the bottom, working with the careful deliberateness she brought to everything. The photographs went into the documentation file that already ran to more than 300 images taken since the first day of the authentication process. Every step of what was about to happen would be on record. Then she opened the lid. The air inside the case had the quality of the chamber air itself, the same cold mineral stillness, but with an additional note, something organic, the faint smell of old paper the way only very old paper smelled, the specific chemistry of 241-year-old ink and parchment in a sealed space. Inside were 2 items. The first was a folded document, what appeared to be a letter, written on paper that had the cream color of old parchment and the specific weight of handmade paper from the period. It was folded in thirds, the fold lines still crisp rather than crumbled, a testament to the conditions that had preserved it. The second was a bound ledger, thin, the covers made from a heavier paperboard, the pages stitched together along the spine with what appeared to be linen thread that had browned but not broken. Dr. Solis used the microspatulas to open the letter, inserting the thin metal sheets along the fold lines before opening them, allowing the paper to be eased rather than bent. The letter unfolded in 3 slow movements. The ink was brown, as old ink became, but clear. The handwriting was the careful copperplate of a man who had written formally and deliberately, taking his time, knowing this document might need to speak for itself across a long period. Dr. Holt leaned in. She read it first, silently, while Dr. Solis held the letter flat with the microspatulas. Then she read it aloud for everyone present. To whoever holds this mill by rightful title and has need of what is stored below. These goods were placed in the chamber on the 22nd day of August 1778. I am Ezekiel Alderman, merchant and landowner, late of Philadelphia and now of this valley, and I write this in the knowledge that the British advance then active in the valley may result in my death, the destruction of this property, or my prolonged absence. In any of these events, it is my wish that whoever reads this letter should understand the nature and origin of what they have found and know that it was accumulated through lawful trade over 20 years. The gold through commerce with British merchants in the years before the conflict when such commerce was lawful, and the coin through trade with continental merchants, and through the proceeds of provisions supplied to the armies of the Continental Congress in the months preceding the writing of this letter. I am not a man of elaborate speech, so I will not write at length. The ledger in this case contains a full inventory of all goods stored below, with weights, origins, and values set at the prices current in this valley in the summer of 1778. I remained at this mill while my neighbors departed because I would not trust the concealment of these goods to chance, and because I believed, as I believe now, that a man of property owes his property his presence when that property is under threat. If I have survived and the war has ended, I expect to return and retrieve what is here stored. If you are reading this, I did not return in time. In that event, let what is stored below serve the purposes of whoever holds this mill rightfully. I ask only this, that some portion of whatever value these goods carry be used in service of the institutions of the new nation, whose founding I believe to be the most significant act of this century and perhaps of many centuries. I write this in my own hand and place it here alongside the inventory, trusting to the stone and the cold and the darkness to keep both until they are needed. Ezekiel Alderman, his mark. Below the signature was a small stamped mark, the same merchant's mark visible on the crates. Nobody spoke for a long moment after Dr. Holt finished reading. The creek ran outside the north wall, making the sound it had been making since before Ezekiel Alderman had chosen this bend to build on. The fog had lifted fully now, and the March sun came through the window openings on the east face of the mill, sending slanted light across the stone floor. Clara had been listening to the letter with her eyes on the stone floor. She'd heard every word, understood them all, but there was one line she was still sitting inside. The way you stayed inside a sentence when it landed somewhere specific and didn't move through you the way ordinary language moved through you. I remained at this mill while my neighbors departed because I would not trust the concealment of these goods to chance. That was the part Daniel would have underlined. She looked up. Dr. Holt was watching her, not the letter, the way Dorothy sometimes watched her, with the particular attention of someone who understands that a person can receive difficult information without showing the receiving of it externally, and who is waiting to know if there's anything needed. There wasn't. Clara was fine. She was better than fine. She was standing in a 276-year-old mill in March sunlight reading a letter from a man who had trusted the earth to keep faith and had been right, and the feeling that went with that was not happiness exactly, and not grief, and not triumph, and what it actually was she didn't have a name for yet. It was what came from being in the presence of something that turned out to be exactly what you'd understood it to be, without knowing why you'd understood it. That feeling had a specific weight. Dorothy said, quietly, "He didn't make it back. He died in 1791, Dr. Holt said. 13 years after he wrote this. It's possible he survived the war and spent those years intending to retrieve what was here and never did. It's also possible that the concealment worked so well that he didn't need to retrieve it immediately, and then he died before he could." Clara looked at the letter, held flat by the microspatulas, the brown copperplate script clear in the lantern light. She thought about a man writing this in August of 1778 with the knowledge that British soldiers might be at his door within the week. Writing it carefully, formally, not in haste, but in deliberation. Trusting the stone and the cold and the darkness. That phrase, from the letter itself, the same phrase she'd been thinking in different words since the first morning she'd crouched at the foundation wall. "W-I-S," she said. Dr. Holt looked at her. "Above the door," Clara said. "The 3 letters. I've been thinking about what they stand for." Dr. Holt waited. "The letter is addressed to whoever holds this mill by rightful title and has need of what is stored below." Clara paused. "Whoever is seeking. It's a marker. Above the door, visible to anyone looking at the lintel, in a position that someone who was specifically looking for a mark would look. He put a sign above the door to tell the right person where to look." Dr. Holt was quiet for a moment. She looked at the letter. Looked at Clara. "That's consistent with merchant conventions of the period. A coded marker that would mean nothing to casual observation and everything to the person who had the right information." She paused. "It's also consistent with the man who wrote this letter. He's not a man who left things to chance." Dr. Solis moved the letter carefully back toward the case, allowing it to remain flat and open on the padded platform. She opened the ledger next, more slowly, the linen thread spine requiring gentle lateral pressure to open it all. The pages inside were the same cream parchment, the entries in the same copperplate hand, organized in columns. Each line of the inventory identified a stored item, its location in the chamber, its weight or count, its origin, and its 1,778 value in pounds sterling. The gold bars occupied the first 14 pages. 178 bars were listed, each with its weight, its British assay mark, and the trade through which it had been acquired. The lightest was 9 pounds. The heaviest was 31. The average was 18. The coins occupied the next 30 pages. More than 2,000 individual entries, each coin identified by its type, its mint, its year of issue, and its condition as Alderman had assessed it in 1778. His assessments were those of a trained merchant, not a numismatist in the modern sense, but they were precise enough that Dr. Chun, when he reviewed photographs of the ledger pages the following day, could cross-reference Alderman's descriptions against the coins he'd already examined. The crates held silver plate services, 12 complete settings, each piece individually listed with its weight and maker's mark. They held oilskin-wrapped collections of jewelry, each piece described in the ledger in the spare language of a man cataloging merchandise. One gold brooch set with emeralds, one chain necklace, gold, length approximately 14 inches, one pair of earrings, garnet stones. The jewelry had come from his wife, the ledger noted in one of only 2 personal annotations. He does not say her name. He notes only that she gave them willingly for this purpose and asked only that they be returned to her or to her children if the war was short. The war was not short. The crates held silver plate services, 12 complete settings, each piece individually listed with its weight and maker's mark. They held oilskin-wrapped collections of jewelry, each piece described in the ledger in the spare language of a man cataloging merchandise. One gold brooch set with emeralds, one chain necklace, gold, length approximately 14 inches, one pair of earrings, garnet stones. The jewelry had come from his wife, the ledger noted in one of only 2 personal annotations. He does not say her name. He notes only that she gave them willingly for this purpose and asked only that they be returned to her or to her children if the war was short. The war was not short. The 2 personal annotations in the ledger were the only places where Ezekiel Alderman's voice became something other than the voice of a merchant keeping inventory. The first was the note about his wife's jewelry. The second was on the last page, beneath the final entry, in smaller letters than the rest of the ledger, as though written in a different session at a different moment. Dr. Holt read it aloud. My children are W, I, and S. If this finds them, they should know their father kept faith with what he promised. If it finds others, let them know a man of this valley kept faith with the new nation and trusted the earth to honor that faith until it could be claimed. W, I, S, William, Isabel, Samuel. Not a code, not an instruction. A father's initials for his 3 children, carved above his door as a marker they would recognize if they ever came looking. They never came looking. And the earth had honored the faith for 241 years. Dorothy said, from behind her, he carved their names above the door. Yes. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality it had when she was being precise about something that she felt required precision. He sealed everything up in that chamber with his children's initials as the finder's mark, and not one of them ever found it. No. And 241 years later, a woman who bought the property for $200 found it in 3 visits. Clara looked at the letters. WIS. 3 children who had grown up, presumably, without their father's assets, without the inheritance he'd secured and placed and trusted the earth to keep, who had lived their lives in whatever circumstances the Revolutionary War's aftermath had left them in, not knowing what was under the floor of the mill their father had built. She thought about what that meant for a long time. Not about the money. About the father who had done everything right, who had prepared and sealed and marked and stayed at his post, and then died before any of it could be retrieved. About the children who had perhaps stood at this door and read these letters and understood only a surname, not a message. About the things you prepared for people who came after you, and whether they arrived. Let's go back to the cars, she said finally. 3 separate specialist firms were engaged. Foster coordinated the scheduling and the access protocols, which meant nobody arrived at the chamber without a documented appointment and a formal chain of custody agreement for any items removed for testing. This was not bureaucratic caution for its own sake. It was the specific precaution required when the legal ownership of a $400 million collection was still being formally established, and every removed item needed to be traceable, documented, and properly returned pending the legal opinion Foster was finalizing. He delivered that formal opinion on the 2nd Friday of April. The deed language in the county tax-lien auction sale conveyed the property and all structures, fixtures, and contents as of the date of sale, with no exclusions. The county had sold Clara everything on the property. A property law specialist at UVA had reviewed the full chain of title back to the original colonial land grant and found nothing that limited the conveyance. Clara owned the chamber, the stones of the chamber, the air of the chamber, and everything inside it. She read the opinion once, nodded, put it in the folder with the auction receipt. The gold bars were assayed by a metals specialist from New York whose firm worked primarily with auction houses and private collections. She took 1 bar for destructive testing, with Clara's documented permission, and confirmed the purity at 94%, which was the highest grade of gold commercially produced in the 1760s through legitimate British assay processes. The assay marks matched the British Mint records from the period, which were publicly available in archival form, and the correspondence was exact. The coins were examined by Chun and two colleagues over 3 weeks. The brasher doubloons numbered 4, as Chun had initially counted, and all 4 were confirmed authentic by both numismatic examination and XRF analysis, which was a non-destructive testing method that measured the metal composition and confirmed it matched the known profile of Ephraim Brasher's documented gold alloy from 1787. 3 of the 4 doubloons were in the grade range that numismatic standards described as mint state, which for coins produced in 1787 and sealed almost immediately was explicable, and the grade assessment put them at the upper range of any known example of the type. The 1776 Continental dollars were 8 in number, all in exceptional condition, all authentic. In circulated condition, a 1776 Continental dollar traded for a few $1,000s. In the grades represented by Alderman's coins, the market was thinner and the values were determined by the most comparable recent auction results. The most recent was for $1 million. Several of the Alderman examples were assessed as superior to that auction result. Chin's formal report ran to 47 pages. He'd been in the field for 40 years and had written many reports. Clara read the executive summary and the conclusion and let Foster handle the 45 pages in between. The silver plate and jewelry were assessed by a specialist in colonial-era decorative arts, a woman from the Winterthur Museum who drove up twice and spent 2 full days with the crate contents after they'd been carefully removed and transported under controlled conditions to a facility in Charlottesville that Dr. Holt had arranged. The jewelry was not as valuable as the coins or the gold, but several pieces were identifiable as work from specific Philadelphia silversmiths whose documented output was very small, which gave them a provenance premium that the specialist noted carefully. Foster received the 3 formal assessment reports on the same Thursday, in late May. He called Clara and asked her to come to his office in Woodstock. Owen drove from Charlotte for it, though Clara hadn't asked him to. Dorothy drove Clara, though Clara hadn't asked her to either. They sat in Foster's conference room, the 4 of them, and he opened the manila folder and read the aggregate conclusion. The total assessed value of all items recovered from the Alderman Mill chamber, taking into account current market conditions for comparable material, historical provenance premiums, and the numismatic assessments of the coin collection as a whole, was $445 million. He said it flat, the way he said things when the number was large enough that presentation would be insulting. Then he set the report on the table and let them sit with it. Dorothy looked at the window. Owen looked at the table. Clara looked at Foster. "That's real," she said. "That is the formal assessed value, yes. The actual realized value at auction will vary. Some items will exceed the assessment. Some will come in below it. The gold bars are the most predictable element because gold has a daily spot price and the premium for historical provenance on bars of this age and documentation is well established. The coins are the most variable. If 2 major collectors decide they both want the same brasher doubloon, the price goes wherever they take it." He was quiet for a moment. None of them said anything, which was the appropriate response to the number, and all of them understood that. Dorothy, who had been sitting with this information for 2 months longer than Owen had, sat with a stillness that Clara recognized as the stillness of a woman who had been right about something she hadn't permitted herself to say she was right about. Owen had his notebook open. He'd brought it the way he always brought it, the way Daniel had always brought a pen. What's the timeline from decision to proceeds? If Clara chooses to go to auction through a major house, the preparation and consignment process takes approximately 6 months. The auction itself would likely be spread across 2 sales, one for the coins and one for the gold and material objects. Sotheby's and Heritage have both been mentioned as appropriate houses by Dr. Chun. She'd receive approximately 85% of the hammer price after house commission. The legal position, Owen said. Solid. The deed language in the county auction sale conveys the property with all contents as of the date of sale. I have a formal opinion from a property law specialist at UVA who reviewed the chain of title and the deed language. Clara owns everything in that chamber. Raymond Voss filed a historical preservation claim. Owen said. He did. The County Historical Preservation Board rejected it as procedurally improper because the claim was filed by a party with no documented historical interest in the property. Voss then engaged a lawyer in Washington who filed in circuit court arguing that the contents qualified as historically significant assets that should be placed under a state preservation order, which would have effectively frozen the estate and given the state first right of purchase. Foster paused. The judge dismissed it last week. The dismissal was 4 pages. The relevant paragraph noted that the plaintiff had no standing, that the legal owner of the property had already initiated voluntary engagement with the State Historical Preservation Office, and that the filing appeared to be motivated by commercial rather than historical interest, which was not a basis for injunctive relief. Clara had read the 4-page dismissal twice the week before. She'd read the relevant paragraph 4 times. "What did Raymond do?" she said. "His lawyer called me Monday. Raymond is prepared to make a formal offer of $25 million for the property and all contents." "No," Clara said. "That was my expectation. I'll communicate your response." "Tell him the mill isn't for sale," Clara said. "Tell him specifically that the mill isn't for sale. The other assets will go through the auction process, but the property is mine." Foster nodded. "He'll try again. He can try as many times as he likes." After the meeting, they sat in Foster's parking lot for a few minutes before driving. Not because there was anything to say, but because the day required a moment of standing still in it. A cardinal was working the parking lot edge where someone had planted ornamental grasses, pulling seeds from the dried heads with the focused patience of a bird that knew exactly what it was doing. Dorothy was the one who spoke first. "Raymond Voss is going to make a formal offer," she said. "He already has," Foster said, "through his Washington lawyer. $25 million for the property and all contents." Dorothy's expression didn't change. "He thinks he still has a play here. He always thinks he has a play. It's the kind of man he is." Foster looked at Clara. "I told him the same thing you told me to tell him." "Good. He'll try again. He can." Clara looked at the cardinal, which had found what it was looking for and had moved on to the next grass head with the same methodical focus. "He can try as many times as he likes. It won't matter." There was something specific about saying that, about having the legal ground under her to say it and mean it. 8 months ago, she had $200 and a mortgage servicer on the phone and a son she hadn't yet called because she wasn't ready to be helped. Now she had a foundation and a mill and an architect and a wheel that would turn by June and the $445 million assessed value of a collection she'd bought for the cost of the filing fee at a county auction. And Raymond Voss could make his formal offers through his Washington lawyer, and she would decline each one with the same courtesy and the same permanence. Owen said, "What are you going to do with it?" Clara watched the cardinal. "I've been thinking about that." "I know you have." She'd been thinking about it since March, since the first morning she'd stood outside the chamber and felt the size of what was in it without yet knowing the number. The number changed the specifics, but not the shape of the thinking, which had been, what does a person do when something returns to them that they didn't know was lost? Not what can she buy? Not where can she go? What does she do with it? The mill, she would keep. That was not a question. She would have it properly assessed for structural restoration, would hire an architect who worked with historic stone buildings, would restore the mill race channel and the wheel housing and the roof and eventually the mechanism itself. Not to make it functional, though that might be possible. To honor it. To return it to something close to what Ezekiel Alderman had built and what 276 years had partially undone. She would establish a foundation. The Alderman Mill Historical Foundation, which would use a portion of the auction proceeds to fund colonial American history research, with a specific focus on the Shenandoah Valley and with a secondary focus on material culture, the kind of work Dr. Holt did. Dr. Holt would be invited to sit on the board, which Clara expected she would accept. Dorothy would also be invited to sit on the board, which Dorothy agreed to with the expression of a woman who had been expecting to be asked and had her answer ready. She would donate the document case and its contents to the Smithsonian. Not because she couldn't keep them, but because Ezekiel Alderman had written his letter to whoever holds this mill by rightful title and has need of what is stored below, and Clara didn't have need of what was stored below in the sense he'd meant. She had need of something else. The country had need of the letter and the ledger, the specific humanity of a man writing in August of 1778 about his children's initials and his wife's jewelry and his faith in the new nation. that belonged in a place where anyone could go and read it. Secretary Chun from the Smithsonian had called Foster in October to discuss the donation formally, and his voice on the call, Owen told her afterward, had the quality of a man trying very hard to maintain institutional decorum about something he was not feeling institutional decorum about. She would pay off the mortgage. 11 years of payments cleared in one transaction, a number that 11 months ago had felt like a weight she would carry until she died, reduced to a line item in a financial settlement that would take an afternoon. She would give Owen a gift that she had already decided on and would not negotiate about. He would argue, because he was his father's son and had opinions about financial propriety and about what was appropriate for a parent to give a grown child. She had prepared 3 responses to his argument and delivered the first one, which was enough. She would plant tomatoes in the garden. That last one was the most important of all. The auction was scheduled for October, 2 houses, 2 sales. Heritage would handle the coins in Dallas on the 14th. Sotheby's would handle the gold, silver, and material objects in New York on the 22nd. Foster managed the consignment process with the kind of sustained professional attention that Clara thought would have made Daniel genuinely respect him, which was a high bar. The Dallas sale ran 11 hours. The 4 Brasher doubloons sold in a single lot, after a 40-minute bidding sequence between 2 private collectors and a consortium representing a museum in Zurich for $41 million. The gavel came down, and the room went briefly quiet, and then there was applause, which was not usual for coin auctions, and Chun was there, and called Clara from the floor with the contained excitement of a man who had spent 40 years in his field without seeing anything that came close to this sale. And she was sitting at Daniel's desk when her phone rang, and she heard the number and sat with it for a moment before she said thank you and hung up. She sat at the desk for a few minutes after hanging up. The bird feeder was visible through the window, a pair of chickadees, the November light thin and clear on the glass. $41 million for 4 coins. Each of those coins had been in a leather sack in a cold-sealed chamber beneath a mill floor for 241 years, and now they were going to a museum in Zurich and to a private collector in London and to another private collector whose name the auction house had kept confidential, which was within their protocols. She thought about the leather sack, about what Chun had looked like when he first opened it, the care he'd taken, the specific quality of stillness that came over him when he'd held the first coin to the light. She thought about Ezekiel Alderman placing those sacks in the chamber in August of 1778 without any mechanism to understand what 241 years would do to the value of what he was placing there. He'd asked only that some portion be used in service of the new nation's institutions. She had already arranged for it. The 3 highest value coin lots from the Alderman collection sold for a combined $131 million. The full coin collection realized $217 million over the course of the sale, clearing the top of the pre-auction estimates by $22 million, because 2 continental dollars came in significantly above the assessment when the same 2 bidders from the doubloon lot returned to the floor with a combined competitiveness that apparently had not been spent. The New York sale was quieter. Gold was gold, and the premium for historical gold of documented provenance was well established, and the bidding was orderly in the way of people who had decided their limits before they arrived. The gold realized $162 million. The silver and jewelry realized $67 million. The mortgage payoff was completed by wire transfer on a Thursday morning in November. Clara was at Daniel's desk when the confirmation email arrived. She read it twice. Then she closed her laptop and sat for a moment looking at the bird feeder through the window, which held a chickadee working the perch in the November light. She thought about month 7, when she'd caught up on the mortgage payment using the last of the savings, and the savings account had read 0. The distance between that morning and this one was 8 months in calendar terms, and whatever the right word was for how far apart they felt, she didn't have it. She'd been bookkeeping that month for 3 clients: the veterinary clinic and a hardware store in Edinburgh, and a family-owned landscaping company whose owner had the same name as Daniel's father, and this coincidence had made her cry in the car after the first appointment, sitting in the parking lot with her hand on the steering wheel, crying about a name. That was month 7. That was who she'd been in month 7, a woman sitting in a parking lot crying about a name. The mortgage was gone. The mill was hers. The chamber was empty and clean, its walls unchanged, its temperature unchanged, its specific, dry, cold stillness exactly what it had been for the past 2.5 centuries. She had no plans to do anything with the chamber except preserve it. It would be part of the Foundation's educational programming, a documented example of colonial preservation engineering that graduate students and historians would study for decades. Dr. Holt was already writing the first academic paper about it, a paper that Clara expected would cause a significant amount of professional excitement in a field that did not often have the opportunity for significant professional excitement. Raymond Voss had submitted a fourth offer in October, through his Washington lawyer, for $35 million, and had received the same response as the previous three. She had not thought about Raymond Voss in any other context since. She did not expect to think about him again. Clara drove to the mill on a Saturday in late November. The restoration work had been underway since August. The architect, a woman named Susanna Cole who had done 3 previous historic mill restorations in the Mid-Atlantic region, had her crew working on the roof first, then the north wall repointing, then the mill race channel. The wheel was being assessed by a specialist in historic mill machinery who had come down from Pennsylvania and spent 2 days examining the iron framework and the surviving wood before producing a report that concluded the wheel could be restored to operational status, which Clara had not expected and which Susanna found genuinely exciting. The interior of the chamber had been professionally emptied over a careful 4 days in June, each item documented in its position before removal, each item wrapped and transported under conditions that the preservation specialists had specified. The chamber now held nothing. Clara went in with a flashlight, the same one she'd used on the first morning, and stood in the empty space for a while. The walls were the same dark fitted stone. The ceiling was the same arched underside of the mill floor above. The flagstone floor was clean and level. The cold and the mineral smell and the absolute stillness were the same as they had been on the first morning she'd reached her arm in through the opening and felt the air. She put her hand on the north wall. The stone was cold and smooth, fitted without mortar to a tolerance that had held for 2 centuries and would hold for several more. She thought about Ezekiel Alderman standing in this room in August of 1778 and looking at what he'd placed here and latching the document case and climbing out and fitting the stones back into the wall from outside and smoothing the joints until they were invisible. She thought about him walking through the mill and out the main door and looking up at the letters he'd carved above the lintel, W and I and S. The names of his children reduced to 3 consonants that would mean nothing to a British officer and everything to a William or an Isabel or a Samuel who came looking with the right knowledge. They hadn't come, but the faith had held. It had held for longer than he'd planned for or perhaps imagined possible, and it had held all the way to a county auction on a March morning in 2019 where one woman with $200 had raised her hand when nobody else did. She stood in the empty chamber for about 20 minutes. She didn't think anything particular. She just stood there in the cold and the quiet with her hand on the stone, the way you stood in a place when you wanted to carry the specific feel of it forward with you. Then she came out and stood in the mill's ground floor and looked at the millstones still in their position, the upper one still cracked through its center. The roof repair was done and the stones were dry now, sheltered from weather for the first time in decades. She drove home. April arrived with the particular generosity of the Blue Ridge in spring, warm and specific, the kind of warmth that arrived before the humidity of summer and that Clara had always thought of as the best weeks of the year. The restoration of the mill was nearly complete. The wheel had been returned to its shaft. The mill race channel had been relined and the water redirected, and Susanna had told her the week before that the wheel would turn again by June, which Clara was not sure she believed and was looking forward to being wrong about. She went to the garden on a Saturday morning in April. She hadn't touched the garden since Daniel died. She'd told herself she would get to it and hadn't, and the beds had run to dried stalks and grass and the particular opportunism of weeds that move into unattended ground. She'd hired a woman from down the road to clear it in March, and what remained was bare earth, turned and ready, the same dark garden soil that Daniel had worked for 24 years. She had a trowel. She had a flat of tomato seedlings she'd grown from seed in the kitchen window through February and March, the same heirloom variety Daniel had planted the last morning of his life. She knelt in the garden in the April morning and began to work. The trowel handle was Daniel's trowel, the same one he'd been holding when she found him. She'd put it in the garage in April of the previous year, and not gone back for it. She'd found it in November, when she was looking for something else, and she'd cleaned the dried earth from the blade and oiled the wooden handle and brought it inside and put it in the kitchen drawer. The handle had worn smooth in the specific places where Daniel had always gripped it, the wood carrying the shape of his hands and the way that tools carry their users. She made the first hole in the earth and pressed a seedling into it and firmed the soil around the roots the way Daniel had shown her the first spring they'd lived in this house. He'd been particular about this. Not firm enough and the roots stay compressed and the plant doesn't establish contact with the soil properly. Too firm and you compact the earth around the root zone and restrict drainage. The right amount of pressure, applied with the palms rather than the fingertips, seeded the root ball evenly and closed the hole without disturbing the soil structure. She firmed the first seedling in and sat back on her heels and looked at it. Small, for weeks old. The leaves had the specific light green of young tomato plants that would darken over the summer as the plant grew and the chlorophyll density increased. Daniel had known the name of the process that caused that color change. He'd told her once, at this time of year, in this garden. She couldn't remember the name now. She remembered the quality of his attention when he'd explained it. She thought about Daniel finding the Alderman Mill website, about the specific quality of attention required to look at a property page for an abandoned colonial mill on county land records and think, this is worth keeping. About what that quality of attention was, the kind that recognized something without being able to say what it recognized, the kind that filed things rather than discarding them. She'd had it herself, that morning in the county parking lot, when she'd raised her hand with $200 in a coat pocket and no reason she could have articulated. She'd recognized something and acted on it without knowing what she was acting on. The garden was warm in the April sun. The bird feeder at the kitchen window was occupied. She could see it from where she knelt, 3 finches working the perch with their usual focused competition. The tomato seedlings were going in well, the soil receptive, the roots at home. Owen was driving up that afternoon. Dorothy had already called twice that morning about nothing in particular, which was Dorothy's way of being present without making a production of it. Dr. Holt had emailed from the Foundation's first grant cycle, 3 projects approved, including one that would bring graduate students to the mill site to study Alderman's construction methods in the chamber walls, and another that would fund a search of Philadelphia merchant records for additional documentation of Ezekiel Alderman's life before he came to the valley. The wheel would turn by June. Clara pressed the last seedling into the earth, firmed the soil around it with both hands, the way Daniel had shown her, with intention. She sat back on her heels and looked at the row of small plants, the same variety he'd been planting when his heart had decided it was done, the same dark earth, the same April light slanting across the garden the way it always did at this hour. He would have read everything ever written about Ezekiel Alderman. He would have started with the 1887 county history and worked forward and backward from there, reading every primary source he could locate, and then he would have explained most of it back to her over dinner for several weeks while she listened and asked questions that she found genuinely interesting, because Daniel made most things genuinely interesting when he was explaining them. He would have had opinions about the lead ceiling on the crates. He would have known the names of the Philadelphia silversmiths who made the jewelry, and would have looked up their workshops and found something additional in the records that nobody else had noticed. He would have read Ezekiel Alderman's letter and put it down and been quiet for a while, the way Daniel went quiet when something moved him, and then he would have said something precise and small about it that would stay with her for years. She couldn't tell him. She could plant his tomatoes. She could restore the mill that he'd kept a page about in the plastic bin with the blue lid, the mill he'd found interesting enough to save without knowing why. She could fund the research that would tell the full story of Ezekiel Alderman and his chamber and his letter and his children's initials above the door. She could keep the property and the wheel would turn by June and the mill race would carry water again for the first time in 7 decades, and the creek that had been running past those stones since before the mill was built would run past them for whatever came next. She could keep going, which was what you did when you survived something unsurvivable. One decision at a time, one morning in the garden at a time, pressing roots into the earth that never lied, trusting it to hold what you gave it, and return something from that faith in a form you hadn't anticipated and couldn't have asked for. That was enough. She gathered the empty seedling flat and Daniel's trowel and stood up. The bird feeder was turning in a light wind off the ridge. A pair of Goldfinches had replaced the 3 finches of 10 minutes ago, the turnover of a small world running on its own schedule. $200. A county clerk saying sold. A man who read about things before doing them, who kept a printout for 3 years in a plastic bin because something in the Alderman Mill page caught his attention, and he was the kind of person who kept the things that caught his attention. The wheel would turn by June. She went inside. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.